Once, there was a small lake village called Abernathy, where moss lay in brush strokes across buildings of brick and wood. Grayed stones and a fractured kaleidoscope of dense forest, woodland meadows, and a lake with soft, pebbled banks lay spread across the land. It still exists today, though long ago it is said that 7 little girls and a little boy went for a walk on a Sunday afternoon. They took a circuitous route through the forest this one brisk summer morning, brushing aside spiraled ferns in search of the lake. The group emerged upon the banks of the Great Lake in Abernathy, only to come upon a gray, speckled pony, similar in appearance to a stone, with ragged gray locks for a mane, and a tail that looked matted and wet. A wispy, translucent fog rested upon the surface of the water, a sheet of silver but for the wispy, undulating disruptions of ripples from the horse's soft drinking. The pebbles crunched under the children's footsteps as they crossed onto the shore. The pony glanced up in surprise, revealing eyes black as onyx, absent of any white. One of the little girls crept quietly up to the wild horse, soon arriving next to its head. The pony played with her hair, lifting soft strands of it with its muzzle and snorting. She laughed and mounted him. All the while, the pony maintained a mild and domestic temperament. Then, another girl mirrored her actions, and another, until all 7 were seated on his back. The little boy was more canny, though, and he noticed that the pony grew longer to accommodate each new rider. Indeed, the animal had expanded its flank so much that it had become disproportionate, having adapted to the addition of the 7 astonished and giggling girls. So, instead of joining the girls in their adventure, he took refuge among the high, rough rocks at the end of the lake. Suddenly, the pony turned its head and took notice of him, boring its soulless black eyes into him. As his shivering form clutched, white-knuckled, at the rocks. "Come on, little scabby head," it cried. "Get on my back." But the boy stayed in his shelter, cowering beneath the large structures of the rocks, around which the water had begun to foam at the edges, with the crashing of small waves. For the boy had decided that the talking horse was a merciless occult being, and clearly not a normal wild pony. So, therefore, he should not get on his back. The girls had gone silent. With a shriek of anger, the pony rushed towards him. The little girls screamed, but were unable to pull their hands from its back. Its beautiful speckled coat had dissolved from velvet and morphed into a strong adherent, like a gray paste, in which the girls' hands were stuck. To and fro, the Kelpie and the boy dodged among the rocks and their ebony crevices. But the pony could not reach the boy. And at length, it tired of trying and plunged into the lake with its sevenfold prey on its back. The girls wailing and screaming for help all the while. After a few moments, the boy watched as a shard of light formed between two rocks. The last bubbles of air popping silently on the surface of the water. The boy was found in a catatonic state, staring motionless out onto the lake. The next morning, the livers of the 7 children were washed up on the shore. Welcome, listeners, subscribers, and wanderers. Whoever you may be, this is Our Veil of Smoke and Gold podcast, and I'm your host, Annalise. In both episodes 5 and 6 of our Water Fae unit, we will be exploring the subject of Kelpies, and, in a broad sense, water horses, including the Achiske, the Eik-Ushke, the Kabil-Ushte, and Noggles. Kelpies are recurring motifs in a multitude of stories, ranging from recent fantastical novels to old folktales. In essence, the Kelpie is a freshwater spirit that appears often as a gray horse, which may seem friendly initially, but this is simply their tactic used to entice weary travelers or children onto its back, and it will accommodate them by growing in order to maximize its prey. Once astride, their unfortunate victims become magically stuck, like the 7 girls in the story, and the Kelpie gallops into the water, submerging the riders until they drown. By the way, that is one aspect of this story that I found to be completely sexist. Like, is it not entirely more realistic that the young boy would be the reckless, less vigilant member of this group? And the first to get on the horse? Instead, these girls are portrayed as the thoughtless, audacious ones to just run up to this wild animal. No. No girl I know would do something like that. Honestly, it would not surprise me, though, if any boy my age attempted to tame a wild horse that they happened upon. But anyway, even though the Achiske, Eik Ushke, Kabil Ushte, etc., may not be as recognizable and will not be the main focus of the next 2 episodes, I will also be describing them alongside the Kelpie. Though, fair warning, there is substantially less material on them, and they are very similar to Kelpies, as you'll find. So, now let's look more into Kelpie legend, characteristics, history, and meaning, and what they represent to us as people. Origins, first writings, and role in history. A Kelpie is a shape-changing aquatic spirit of Scottish legend. Its name may derive from the Scottish Gaelic words Kelpech or Gulpach, meaning heifer, a young female cow, or colts. Since the story of this creature originated in Scotland, the Kelpie itself is therefore a part of Celtic mythology. However, the Kabil Ushte are strictly from the region of Manx, an island now a dependency of Britain that is referred to as the Isle of Man. The etymology of their name is likely directly related to a variation of Gaelic spoken on Manx, in which Kabil Ushte probably translates to water horse. The concept of the Eik Ushke also comes from Scotland, with the name literally meaning water horse when translated from Scottish Gaelic. The Achiske is simply a more Irish version of the Eik Ushke. And Noggle is a name confined to the Shetland Islands in Scotland, of which I cannot find the specific meaning, but I'm sure the name relates in some way to the Scottish Kelpie. Whatever the term utilized, the nature of horses and water has been intertwined for nearly as long as humans have kept physical forms of record. The very first of these representations may have been sculpted by the Picts, a clan of Gaelic-speaking people that inhabited Scotland in and before the early medieval times. During what is estimated to be the 6th century, with the Kelpie taking the form of a symbol on a carved stone called the Pictish Beast. Though, whether the Pictish Beast is actually a Kelpie or not is the subject of rigorous debate. There are, of course, many subsequent literary references to the Kelpie. J.F. Campbell has a long passage devoted to the Eich Uisce in Popular Tales of the West Highlands. The tale of the killing of a water horse is told in John Gunn Mackay's More West Highland Tales, Volume 11 specifically. A similar story to Mackay's is told by Walter Gill of the Cabal Uisce. Grant Stewart, in his book Popular Superstitions, tells how a bold MacGregor, nicknamed Wellox, took a bridle off the Kelpie. Anecdotes and descriptions of the Noggle were brought together from various sources by A.C. Black in County Folklore, and so on and so forth. The Kelpie is even mentioned in Robert Burns' poem titled Address to the Dale. Quote, "When thaws dissolve the snowy hoard and float the jiggling icy board, then water Kelpies hunt the fjord by your direction, and nighted travelers are lured to their destruction. And oft your moss-traversing spankies decoy the weight that late and drunk is. The bleeding, cursed, mischievous monkeys delude his eyes, till in some miry slough he sunk is, never more to rise." End quote. And the Gervase of Tilbury, the 13th century author of Autia Imperialia, who was, if you recall, mentioned profusely in our Drax episodes, includes a section of his work dedicated to a creature known as the Grant, whose most natural shape was that of a horse that constantly appeared near water sources, often as a sort of warning. Gervase explicitly places the Grant as a creature of England, stating, quote, "There is in England a certain kind of demon, whom in their language they call Grant, like a yearling foal, erect on its hind legs, with sparkling eyes. This kind of demon often appears in the streets in the heat of the day, or about sunset. If there is any danger impending on the horizon, as in the following day or night, it runs about the streets, provoking the dogs to bark, and, by feigning flight, draws the dogs after it, in the vain hope of catching it, to water. This illusion warns the inhabitants to beware of fire." End quote. Additionally, there stand two 300-ton steel sculptures, almost 100 feet tall, each dubbed the Kelpies, that were designed and built in 2013 by sculptor Andy Scott in the Helix, a parkland extension to the Forth and Clyde Canal in Scotland. I highly recommend Googling this particular structure. These white structural marvels were meant to commemorate the advancement of Scottish irrigation technology and horsepower, if you'll excuse the pun, as well as their drive to continue advancing their waterways system. The potential inspiration for the idea of the Kelpie could have been related to drownings, which continue to be a universal cause of death and are non-discriminate in their victims, like the Kelpie. In this way, the story of a malevolent water spirit luring people to their death acted as a rationalization for the Scottish people as to why the strongest, even the strongest, could succumb to the whims of the elements, being swept away and killed by a cruel tide. Another theory is that the Kelpie is the Scots' interpretation of a divine being taking the form of a horse, which was a common belief in early pagan Europe. To quote Dr. David Anthony's article titled, "Let Them Eat Horses," quote, "Horses were closely linked with specific gods, and the sacrifice of a white horse or a champion racer was associated with events such as the consecration of a new king." End quote. Nature, or personality, physical characteristics, and abilities. Incontestably, the Kelpies are far from benevolent, though the specific degree of their aggression or appetite varies between the different stories and interpretations of the water horse itself. The Eik Uisce is the fiercest and most dangerous of all water horses, with a voracious appetite for human and animal flesh, particularly that of cattle and sheep. Though it tends to reject certain organs, including, as is mentioned in multiple stories, the liver, lungs, and or heart, which consequently rise to the surface of the body of water and float ashore. In addition to its murderous nature, the Eik Uisce appears to transform more readily and take on more physical manifestations of its spirit than any other water horse. The most well-known of these forms is a sleek, handsome horse that is typically gray or silvery in hue, with razor-sharp teeth and constantly wet hair, speckled with sand and seaweed. But they can also be seen as roguish young men, also with sand or seaweed in their hair, or as gigantic birds. The Kabil Ushte are very similar, also pale grayish in color, definitely as dangerous and greedy as the Highland Eik Ushka, though there are not so many tales about them. In the Encyclopedia of Fairies, Catherine Briggs makes a note that, quote, Walter Gill, in a Manx scrapbook, has a story of a Kabil Ushte who, for a short time, visited Carew Cloch on the Dark River. He told of a farmer's wife who found one of her calves missing, with no trace except some tufts of fur. The next day, the farmer saw a monstrous thing rise out of the river, seize one of the calves, and tear it to pieces. They drove the cattle far from the river after that, but they had a worse loss to endure. For a few days later, their child, their only daughter, disappeared and was never heard from again. The Kabil Ushte never troubled them after that. End quote. The Kelpie can assume human form, in which they appear like a rough, shaggy man, or a beautiful raven-haired maiden bathing in a stream. Though, of course, their most usual shape was that of a young horse, sleek and midnight black with dark eyes, having no whites, and a knife-like teeth. Before storms, the Kelpie could be heard howling and wailing. Whether this is a sign of agitation, my sister and cat always cowered at thunder, joy, or warning is unspecified. This specific Scottish beast was not inclined to eat humans in most stories, and rather would drown them, discarding their bodies at the bottom of the lake, or would leap up behind a victim, gripping and crushing them and frightening them almost to death. But their prey was limited to humans. I'm not sure if simply killing humans is much of an improvement from killing and eating them, but Noggles, however, have a very unique disposition, also appearing like a beautiful little gray horse, though they have a tail that curls upward and above their heads, being about the size of a pony, bridled and saddled. They are less malicious than the Kelpie and much less dangerous than the Eik Ushka, choosing not to slaughter humans, but still relishing in causing mischief, especially around watermills, which attract them. The Noggle will vanish in a blue flame on the water if it manages to lure a rider onto its back, but otherwise takes no other form than a horse. there is a version of the Noggle called the Tangi, so named because of the seaweed which covers it. In its horse form, it is not sleek, but covered with rough hair and seaweed. In its human form, it is an old man. Magical characteristics and abilities. As was described earlier, Kelpies and other water horses can occasionally take on other forms. This process is known as therianthropy, transmogrification, metamorphosis, transformation, shapeshifting, and referred to by many other names. But the capacity to change form or shape in a fae is unique in every creature or being. For Kelpies, Achiska, Eikushka, Kabelushte, and Noggles, their transformation is limited to only a few forms, usually between a horse and a man, though sometimes they are capable of shape-shifting into a giant bird or woman, or even a blue flame. Their shape-shifting is not some sort of hypnotism of the beholder of the Kelpie, because in their different forms, the water horses are able to interact physically with their victim, inflicting true pain and harm upon them. Their change is also not costly to their magic, because all water horses are sustained solely by the health and purity of their home in a body of water. Only the Eikushka, the Kelpie, the Achiska, and the Kabelushte have the ability to turn their skin adhesive so that they can trap their riders on their backs with no hope of escape. In most stories that involve more than one person, they don't realize the skin is adhesive until the water horse is satisfied with its prey. It is said the riders are so interminably stuck to the back of their mount that the only way to escape their fate is to cut off the body parts attached to the horse. And this is not possible in most cases. The Kelpie, and this is the only water horse described as having this, may also sometimes be equipped with a magic saddle or bridle that, if wrested off the creature, can be used to perform feats of magic. There is one such example of this in Grant Stewart's Popular Superstitions, of how a bold member of the Scottish MacGregor family, nicknamed Wellox, took such a bridle off of a Kelpie. The Kelpie begged him to restore it, but instead, he kept it and used it to work magic. Habitat, homes, and relationship with other fairy folk. Kelpies emanate a baleful energy, an invisible aura that is so morose and depressing that it deters other fairies and magical creatures who are able to sense that this creature is a terrible omen. It is very difficult to connect with someone with a perpetual rain cloud over their head all the time. And I suppose you can compare this to how other fairies would view Kelpies. The same is true of all the other water horses. So there are very few mentions of a Kelpie interacting with another fae. From various descriptions, it is easy to ascertain that water horses are different from other fairies in that they do not maintain any human characteristics whatsoever. Instead, the Kelpie shares an intrinsic and deeply set bond with its element. So much so that it has been isolated from other magical beings. But, obviously this fact does not bother them because they're not the same as us, due to their profound dependency and connection to water. The relationship between Kelpies and their element is a nice segue into habitat, because they are sometimes viewed as a spirit of the body of water they inhabit. What this spiritual connection to a force of nature often entails is that the creature's own life force and strength at a given time fluctuates based on the health and vitality of their nature home. So it is with Kelpies and their river abodes, as well as with dryads and their trees. The duty of the magical being is to protect their natural life force. Because if their river is polluted, or the tree cut down, the creature deteriorates along with it, experiencing the same sickness and the same pain. Kelpies and Kabelushte specifically live in running fresh water, such as rivers and streams. But the Ake Ushka only inhabits lakes and the ocean. And the Achiska can only be sustained by salt water. Many times seen galloping with the waves of the sea. Different still is the Noggle, who appears to have a particular affinity to watermills. Messing with these mills is one of the Noggle's favored pastimes, and if the mill were running at night, it would seize the wheel and stop it. Its other trick was to loiter along the mill stream and allure pedestrians to mount it. It would then dash away into the sea and give its rider a severe and even dangerous dunking. But it did not tear its victim to pieces. It merely rose through the water and vanished in a blue flame. relationship with humans and how to find, interact with, lure, trap, or repel them. It has been made highly obvious throughout this episode that Kelpies are not a friendly fae. They represent the darkest and cruelest aspects of water. And it would make sense if watercourses had a spiritual relation to their habitat. That they would target that natural landform's most foreboding and detrimental predator: man. So, Ek Ushka, Achiska, and Kabel Ushte feast on the flesh of humans, rejecting only specific organs, like the liver, lungs, and heart. Or hunt their herds, depleting the locals' income and source of food, and therefore harming them in an alternative way. It is why the Kelpies drown any soul foolish or careless enough to mount it, sometimes allowing the bodies of their prey to sink to the bottom of the river, or otherwise ripping them to shreds. The Noggle is the only waterhorse that is truly benign to human life, as long as you don't mind a day's work lost or being the victim of a couple tricks. But despite these beings' ravenous appetite for people, there are various methods of reducing their danger to yourself, including by domesticating them, scaring them off, or banishing them entirely. It was mentioned earlier that Kelpies are occasionally in possession of magic bridles, and that these bridles had the potential to be stolen and used for magic. However, it is additionally possible to tame a water horse, capturing it and forcing it into servitude using an ordinary bridle or saddle. There are stories telling that the man who put a human bridle on the Kelpie could subdue him to his will. Author Robert W. Chambers writes of a man named Graham of Morphy, who once managed to bridle a Kelpie and used him to drag stones to build his new castle. When the castle was built, he took off the bridle, and the poor, emaciated Kelpie dashed into the river. But as he did so, he turned back only once with a sneer, saying, "Ser back and ser banes, drivin' the Lord of Morphy's stones. The Lord of Morphy will never thrive so long as the Kelpie is alive." From then on, misfortune dogged the Grahams of Morphy until their lives ended. November, especially, is the best time to locate the Achiska, who were once extremely common and used to gallop along the sands or over the fields. And if people could get them away from their water source and saddle and bridle them, they would make the finest horses. But they must be ridden inland, for if they got so much as a glimpse of salt water, they would gallop headlong into the sea, carrying their riders with them, and burying them deep in the sea, where they would then be devoured. A major deterrent for all water horses that contradicts their most primitive nature is iron, heated to such a degree that it turns red, like an angry flame. If you bear a red-hot iron rod, every Kelpie will cower in its presence. Yet, they are untouchable by any other weapon. If exposed directly to this material for long enough, it is possible for the Kelpie to be banished or eliminated entirely, reduced to a puzzle of iridescent liquid. But, and maybe I'm the only one who thinks this, who would want to destroy a piece of pure magic? A representation of the heart of nature so completely. Many stories confirm the Kelpie's abhorrence of heated metal, including the tale of the killing of a waterhorse, one of the Eich Uisce, as told in author John Mackay's More West Highland Tales, by a smith in Rosai, a small island of Scotland. He raised a family through the then lucrative business of herding cattle. One night, his daughter did not return from the pastures, and later, in the morning, they found her heart and lungs on the lakeside in the nearby forest, known to be haunted by the Eich Uisce. The smith was heartbroken and filled with a dogged determination to destroy the monster. He set up a makeshift forge by the lake, and he and his young son forged great iron hooks and made them red hot in the fire. They roasted a sheep on the fire as bait for the creature, and the scent of it went out over the water. A steaming mist arose soon after, and the waterhorse, looking like an ugly, shaggy yearling, rose out of the lake. It seized the spitted sheep, and the man and his son grappled it with the hooks, looping them around the neck of the creature, and killed it there. But in the morning, there were no bones nor hide, only a heap of iridescent liquid, what appeared as a jelly-like substance found on the shore. Probably the remnants of a stranded jellyfish. But supposed by the Highlanders to be all that is left of a fallen star, called starshine. And that was the end of the Waterhorse of Versailles. For particularly bothersome noggles hanging around watermills, it is recommended by Catherine Briggs that, quote, it could be driven off by thrusting a burning brand or long steel knife through the vent hole of the mill. End quote. And unfortunately, it is also possible to kill kelpies by way of pollution. For their inherent connection to their water source will not allow them to live in a poisoned river or ocean. But I beseech you, this is not the way to handle things, and we must stop deploying toxic waste into nearby water sources. If not for the kelpies, then for ourselves and the other indigenous plants and animals that depend on them. There you have it. Part 2 of our Kelpies episode has finally come to a close. Of course, we also talked about the Eik Ushka, Kabel Ushte, Achiska, and Noggles, but the Kelpie was the creature of focus. I really hope you were able to take something from this episode, even though it was a bit longer than the typical episode. Apologies for that if you didn't enjoy it. Please leave a rating and review, preferably a high one, but whatever you feel is necessary, on whatever podcasting source you're listening to this from. And you can contact me at ourveilofsmokeandgold@gmail.com regarding any concerns, feedback, suggestions on fairies, or anything else you want me to know. If you notice any corrections, I am happy to welcome them and acknowledge them on the podcast. So talk to me about that if you feel the need. You can also follow us at our Instagram handle at Our Veil of Smoke and Gold Podcast, or at our Twitter handle at Our Veil. Once again, thank you so much, listeners, for listening to me for this whole nearly an hour episode. I'm Annalise, the host of Our Veil of Smoke and Gold podcast. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you in our part 2.